now to discuss this and other stories around today is Labor frontbencher Jason Clare. Thanks very much for your time today.
Morning, Dave.
It seems we're getting pretty close to the full deployment of Australian Special Forces in Iraq.
Well, it seems that way, and whilst this hasn't been confirmed, it seems intuitively right that if we have special forces on the ground in Iraq providing training and support for the Iraqi military, that they will need this sort of visa to protect themselves, because even though they're not providing a frontline role, when you're training and supporting soldiers that are in the front line in the fight against ISIL, there's always a risk that you'll end up in harm's way, and that's why having access to weapons is so important.
Yeah, and we should have more information on this. The Australian Defence Force will hold a briefing later this morning in Canberra. We'll bring you the details as they come to us. Jason Clare, I also want to ask you about the fight against Islamic State here in Australia, and actually not too far from your neck of the woods in Western Sydney, because earlier this week we saw that 47-year-old man who was shot in the face. And although police said that they couldn't see any obvious motive at this point, yesterday the Prime Minister said that it seemed that this attack had been influenced by Islamic State. What's your view of this, and how concerning is it?
Well, we're hearing different news. Yesterday it was suggested that it was linked to ISIL. There were reports, as you say, yesterday afternoon that this might have been the result of an internal dispute between individuals at the mosque, so we just don't know. But what we do know is this, that there are people in our community that are preying on young men, inciting them or encouraging them to go overseas. And let's be very frank about it, there is the risk that this could break out on our streets, and that's why the work that our law enforcement agencies do is very important, and why the work that community leaders, parents, teachers do is important to try and immunise our community against this poison.
Yeah, we see in the Australian newspaper today that Australian authorities cracking down on Australians leaving this country to go and fight overseas have actually cancelled 73 passports at the border. They've screened some 16,000 passengers, interviewed about 1,600 of them, and 50 have been offloaded from their planes on security grounds, yet the flow overseas continues.
Well, that's right, and you know, most people hearing that news would find it extraordinary that somebody would want to go to the other side of the world and fight in another war for a terrorist organisation, knowing almost certain death and knowing full well they'll never get to return to Australia, the best country in the world. But it's happening, and we do have a responsibility to stop the flow of money, stop the flow of people, and do more work here in Australia to stop people from being interested in doing such a stupid, crazy thing in the first place.
It's about a week now since the third round of anti-terrorism legislation was introduced into the Parliament. This is the legislation that concerns metadata and the forced collection of huge amounts of data by telecommunications and telecommunications companies, I should say, and internet service providers. Now that you've had a bit of time to look at this legislation, what's Labor's position on it? Will you offer the bipartisan support that has been offered up till now?
We don't have a predetermined position. We've got time now to go through the legislation in detail and to hold proper hearings and talk to ASIO, the Federal Police and other law enforcement agencies about why they need these powers, to look at the experience of countries overseas, to talk to internet service providers about what they think of this as well. It's national security legislation, but it's more than that, David. It's about privacy as well. It affects everybody that has a mobile phone, everyone that uses the internet. There are real potential costs for everybody that has a phone contract or an ISP contract as well. So we're going to step through this slowly but surely. The government has announced a working group made up of law enforcement agencies and the telco sector to look at how much this will cost and what sort of data they want to retain. We want to look at the outcomes of that working group, have a look at that with the parliamentary committee, and then make recommendations to the government and the parliament about what changes maybe should be made to this legislation.
Jason Clare, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Dave.